As Karen followed the officer down the corridor, she couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened in the past few hours. Her mind was racing with thoughts and worries, but she tried her best to stay calm. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but the reality of the situation was setting in. She had done something wrong, and now she would have to face the consequences. The officer led her into a larger room, one that was more official-looking, with a long wooden table and several chairs. There were people sitting at the table, but they didn't look at her when she entered. They were deep in conversation, writing notes, and talking quietly among themselves. It felt strange to Karen, almost as though she had stepped into a courtroom without the formalities. Her stomach twisted as she wondered what kind of decisions were being made about her right now. The officer motioned for her to sit in a chair near the table, and she obeyed without saying a word. Her hands were clammy, and her heart was pounding. She couldn't look up, afraid of the looks she might get from the people around her. They all seemed so serious, and Karen felt out of place in the middle of their discussions. For a while, no one spoke to her, and the room was filled with the sounds of scribbling pens and quiet murmurs. Karen tried to focus on the little things around her, how the walls were a dull gray, how the air felt thick and heavy, but nothing could distract her from the nervousness swirling in her chest. Finally, one of the people sitting at the table, a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, looked up at her. "Karen, is it?" she asked, her voice calm and steady, though there was a sharpness to it that made Karen sit up a little straighter. "We've reviewed everything, and we understand the situation. We know you didn't intend to cause any harm, but you did break the law. We need to discuss what happens now." Karen nodded slowly, her throat tight. She wanted to explain again that it had just been a joke, that she never meant to make anyone uncomfortable, but she kept quiet. She could tell that this was not the time for more explanations. They had made their decision, and now she had to hear it. The woman continued, her voice professional, but still carrying the weight of authority. "Because of the nature of the offense, we cannot simply ignore what happened. However, we also acknowledge that you have no prior record and that your intentions were not malicious. We believe that a fair consequence is necessary, but we also want to offer you a chance to make amends." Karen listened intently, her heart racing. Make amends? What did that even mean? Was she going to be fined? Would she have to apologize publicly? She wasn't sure what they expected from her, but she knew she needed to take whatever punishment they offered. "Here's what we've decided," the woman said, and Karen's stomach tightened as she braced herself. "You will be required to attend a community service program that focuses on understanding respect and the role of public figures in society. Additionally, you will be given a fine for your actions." She paused, watching Karen carefully. "This is not a punishment meant to ruin your life, but rather to help you understand the gravity of your actions. We believe this will help you learn from your mistake and prevent anything like this from happening again." Karen couldn't believe what she was hearing. Community service, a fine. It wasn't nearly as bad as she had feared, but it still felt like a heavy consequence for what she thought had just been a harmless prank. She tried to gather her thoughts, her emotions swirling inside her. I understand," Karen finally said, her voice quieter than she expected. It was the only thing she could think to say. The woman nodded. "Good. We trust that you will take this seriously and complete the program. We will be in touch with the details." She looked around the table at the other people, who seemed to nod in agreement. "You're free to go for now. Please make sure you follow through on the requirements, and this will remain on record, but you won't face any further legal action." Karen stood up, her legs feeling weak, and followed the officer out of the room. She was still trying to process what had just happened, trying to make sense of everything. It was over, but it wasn't over. She still had to fulfill her community service, still had to pay the fine. But she wasn't going to jail. She wasn't going to lose everything because of a silly mistake. As she walked back down the hallway, the officer next to her didn't say anything, but Karen felt a sense of relief washing over her. It wasn't what she had hoped for. She had hoped for it all to just go away, but it was the best outcome she could have gotten. She had learned a valuable lesson today, and she knew that she would never take a joke that far again. Karen walked slowly down the hallway, her mind still swirling with uncertainty. The officer who had escorted her gave her no indication of what was coming next. His pace was steady, and his face remained unreadable, but Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking deeper into a situation she didn't fully understand. Every step seemed to echo in the silence, and she felt like she was being led to some unknown fate. As they turned a corner, Karen caught sight of a small plain door. The officer stopped in front of it and motioned for her to step inside. She hesitated for a moment, not sure what to expect. She had no idea what this holding area would be like, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to face whatever awaited her. Despite the officer's calm demeanor, the lack of answers had left her feeling more nervous than ever. Taking a deep breath, Karen stepped through the door. The room was small and simple, with just a few metal chairs and a desk in the corner. The walls were plain, and there were no windows, making the space feel even more confining. It wasn't a cell. At least it didn't look like one, but it was certainly far from comfortable. The officer closed the door behind her with a soft click, leaving her alone in the quiet room. Karen moved slowly to one of the chairs and sat down, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She wanted to keep calm, but the silence and the uncertainty of the situation were too much to ignore. What was going to happen now? She thought again. She had never been in trouble like this before, and now she was stuck waiting for some kind of resolution that felt so far out of her reach. She tried to focus on her breathing, to remind herself that she had made a mistake, but it wasn't the end of the world. She could still fix this. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding that could be cleared up, she thought, even though deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. There had been consequences, and those couldn't be undone with just an apology. She had done something that couldn't be easily overlooked, and now she had to face whatever would come next. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as Karen sat alone in the small room. Every tick of the clock felt louder, as though it was marking the passing of time that was slipping away from her. She could feel her nerves building again, and she fought the urge to stand up and start pacing. There was nothing she could do but wait, and the waiting was driving her crazy. Her thoughts kept returning to the Royal Guard. They had been so stern, so unyielding in their response. She hadn't meant to disrespect them or cause any trouble. It was just a moment of silliness, a harmless prank. But now, the seriousness of the situation was clear, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of regret. If she could go back and undo it, she would. But there was no going back now. All she could do was wait and hope that somehow she would be able to make it right. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again, and Karen's heart jumped. The officer from before stepped inside, his face still calm, but this time there was something different in his expression. He looked at her for a moment before speaking. "Miss, we've completed our review, and there are some decisions that have been made," he said, his voice steady. "It's time to discuss your next steps." Karen stood up quickly, her nerves firing again as she tried to steady herself. What next steps? Her mind raced, trying to prepare for whatever came next, but the fear of the unknown was overwhelming. The officer motioned for her to follow him, and she did, her heart pounding in her chest. As they walked down the hallway, the weight of the decision that had been made loomed large. Karen couldn't focus on anything else. She knew that whatever came next would be the turning point in how this whole situation would unfold. Would she be let go with a warning? Or would there be more serious consequences? The officer led her through a different part of the building this time, and Karen noticed the environment had changed. There were more people around, more activity, and it felt like she was leaving the quiet, private space where she had been waiting and entering a larger, more official area. The sounds of footsteps and voices grew louder as they walked, and Karen felt her nerves return with full force. She had been caught in something much bigger than she could have imagined, and now She was about to find out how everything would end. Karen sat in the chair, her hands still trembling, and the weight of the situation pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She tried to calm her racing thoughts, but it was difficult. The room, which had seemed somewhat ordinary when she first entered, now felt cold and unwelcoming. The officers around her continued to speak in hushed tones, occasionally glancing in her direction, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. The uncertainty of what was going to happen next made her feel more anxious than she had ever felt before. She looked at the man in the suit, who had been the one to explain the seriousness of the situation. He had a stern but professional expression, and she couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking about her. Was he angry? Did he think she was foolish? She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. She wasn't a troublemaker. She was just someone who loved to make people laugh. But now, as she sat there, she realized that her harmless little prank had turned into something she couldn't control. The officer who had escorted her into the room stepped forward, breaking the silence. "We've reviewed the situation," he said, his voice calm but serious. "We understand your intentions, and we acknowledge that you didn't mean any harm. However, the circumstances surrounding your actions have led to a need for further evaluation." His words didn't offer much comfort, but Karen tried to listen carefully. Evaluation. What did that even mean? The man in the suit nodded as the officer spoke, his gaze never leaving Karen's face. He seemed to be weighing her every word, every gesture, as if he were trying to decide something important. Karen felt like she was under a microscope, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was far beyond anything she had imagined when she first thought of splashing the guard with water. She wasn't just dealing with a prank gone wrong anymore. This was about her actions being examined by people who had far more authority than she could have ever expected. "Is there any way to make this right?" Karen finally asked, her voice quiet but filled with desperation. She had been sitting there for what felt like an eternity, and the fear of the unknown was growing stronger with each passing minute. She wanted to do anything she could to fix this, to make the situation better, but she had no idea where to begin. The man in the suit regarded her carefully, his face expressionless. "The law must be followed," he said simply. "But we are not here to make an example of you. The facts will be reviewed, and we will proceed from there." Karen tried to understand what that meant. It didn't sound like she was going to be immediately punished, but it also didn't sound like this was something that would be over quickly. There was still so much uncertainty. She wanted to ask more questions, to figure out exactly what the next steps were. But something about the way the officers carried themselves made it clear that she wasn't going to get any more answers at that moment. Her stomach churned as she imagined all the possible outcomes. Would she be fined? Would she have to spend time in jail? She had never even been in trouble with the law before, let alone for something so ridiculous. The thought of being stuck in some legal process, dragged through bureaucratic steps, filled her with dread. It wasn't just about the potential consequences anymore. It was the feeling of having lost control over the situation that scared her the most. One of the officers, noticing her growing anxiety, offered her a small gesture of reassurance. "We understand that this has been stressful for you. Take a moment to collect yourself," he said, his voice softening for the first time. Karen nodded, grateful for the kindness, even though she didn't know how to calm her nerves. The room still felt oppressive, and the pressure was beginning to feel unbearable. But at least the officer's words showed some compassion. Time seemed to drag on as Karen sat there in silence, waiting for something, anything, that would tell her what would happen next. The officers spoke quietly among themselves, and Karen tried to focus on their words, hoping for some kind of clue, but all she could catch were fragments of conversation. She could barely concentrate, her mind racing with worries about her future. She had made a huge mistake, and now she was stuck in the aftermath, unsure of what would come next. Just when she thought she couldn't sit there any longer, the man in the suit looked up at her, his face neutral but unreadable. "We will let you know how this will be resolved. In the meantime, you'll be escorted to a holding area while the final details are worked out." Karen felt her stomach drop. A holding area. Was she being detained? She stood up, her legs feeling weak beneath her, and followed the officer to the door. The last thing she saw before Karen sat there, nervously twisting her fingers in her lap as the room seemed to grow colder around her. The silence stretched on, making every passing second feel like an eternity. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, and her mind kept repeating the same questions. What happens now? Will I be okay? The man in the suit, who had been silent for a moment, finally spoke again. He didn't seem angry, but his tone was steady and unyielding. We need to process what happened, and that involves understanding the full scope of the situation, he said, glancing at the officer who had been speaking to Karen earlier. What you did may seem minor to you, but in a place like this, with such a high level of security, even small actions can have large consequences. Karen opened her mouth to speak, to explain that she never intended anything serious, but the words stuck in her throat. She wanted to make them understand that it had all been in good fun. But how could she explain it when the weight of the situation had already sunk in so deeply? She glanced at the officer, who had been quiet up until this point. He looked at her with a mix of patience and authority, as if waiting for her to fully comprehend the gravity of what had happened. I didn't mean to cause trouble, Karen finally said, her voice shaky. It wasn't about disrespecting anyone, I swear. It was just a joke. I didn't think it would be a big deal. Her words seemed so weak in the face of what was happening. She felt embarrassed, almost ashamed, for thinking that a simple prank could lead to something so serious. The officer gave her a sympathetic look but remained professional. I understand that you didn't intend for things to escalate, but you must understand that actions have consequences. You didn't just splash water on a person. You interrupted a national symbol. The Royal Guard represents the safety of the monarchy, and what you did could have been seen as a threat, even if it wasn't meant that way. His voice softened slightly, as if trying to help her grasp the significance of her actions, but it did little to ease the fear that was now settling in her chest. Karen swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. She had never thought of it that way. To her, it had just been a silly joke, something that would make people smile and laugh. But now she realized she had disrupted something much bigger than she had ever imagined. The idea of threatening anyone, let alone the monarchy, felt ridiculous to her, yet the reality of the situation was starting to hit home. Is there anything we can do to make this right? Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wanted to apologize, to somehow fix what she had done. But what could she possibly do to make up for this? She had no idea what the right thing was, and she felt more lost than ever. The man in the suit nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. We will take your statement into account, and the authorities will review the situation, he said. However, you must understand that this is not something that can be brushed off. It will be handled according to the law. His words left Karen feeling even more helpless. Handled according to the law. What did that even mean? Was she going to be arrested? Fined. She couldn't quite wrap her mind around it. The officer gave her a look that seemed to say, "This isn't over yet." Karen sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of their eyes on her, the pressure of the moment crushing her. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with uncertainty. She had hoped this would all blow over quickly, that someone would just laugh it off and let her go with a warning. But as she sat there, her thoughts were racing faster than ever. It wasn't just about the prank anymore. It was about the consequences, and she had no idea how far those consequences would reach. For the next few minutes, no one spoke. The officers exchanged a few quiet words among themselves, but Karen couldn't make out what they were saying. The silence seemed to stretch on forever, and she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would she be allowed to leave? Or would they make an example of her for what she had done? As Karen waited in the tense silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that the events that had started as a small, lighthearted joke had somehow spiraled into something far beyond her control. And now, She had no choice but to wait and see how it all would unfold. Karen sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago, and every pair of eyes seemed to be focused solely on her. The silence in the room was heavy, like everyone was waiting for her to speak, but Karen wasn't sure what to say. She had never been in a situation like this before, and the more she thought about it, the more confused she became. Why had her harmless prank turned into something so serious? She glanced nervously at the officer who had escorted her in. He was still standing by the door, his posture stiff and formal. He wasn't the one who had spoken first when she entered, though. It was the man in the suit who now looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with a calm demeanor that made him seem like someone who had seen it all. He adjusted his glasses before speaking, his voice polite but firm. "Miss, we understand that you were attempting to have some fun. However, splashing water on a member of the Royal Guard is not only inappropriate, but also a disturbance to public order," he said. His words were clear, without any hint of anger, but they carried a weight that made Karen's stomach twist. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her throat felt dry, and she suddenly found it hard to breathe properly. She had no idea how to explain herself in a way that wouldn't make things worse. The officer who had first approached her took a step forward. "We need to understand your intentions," he said, his voice a little softer now. "You were aware of who the Royal Guard are, correct?" Karen nodded, though she felt unsure of herself. She had always known who the Royal Guards were. They were famous for their stoic presence and their role in protecting the monarchy. But she hadn't thought for one second that what she was doing would be taken so seriously. To her, it was just a joke, a way to make people smile. "I didn't mean any harm," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "It was just water. I thought it would be funny." The words felt weak even as she said them. The more she tried to explain, the more she realized how out of place she was in this room, with all these serious faces staring back at her. The man in the suit didn't seem moved by her words. He didn't interrupt, but his gaze remained steady. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The officer who had spoken to her earlier took another step forward. "We understand that you may have thought it was harmless, but this is a matter of respect. The Royal Guard is an important symbol of our nation's security. What you did could be seen as a disrespect to that," he explained, his voice still calm but edged with authority. Karen felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. She hadn't realized the full extent of what she had done. It wasn't just about a silly prank. It was about something far bigger than her. She hadn't meant to offend anyone or disrespect anything, but she could see now that the consequences were more serious than she had ever imagined. Her head swam with confusion as the officers continued to speak in calm, measured tones. The man in the suit looked over at the officer, and then back at Karen. "What we need to understand is why you felt the need to do this. What was your reasoning behind choosing this specific moment and person to play your joke on?" he asked, his tone professional but probing. Karen's mind went blank for a second. She wasn't sure how to explain the playful idea she had in her head. It had been spontaneous, something she did on a whim without thinking of the consequences. "I don't know," she replied honestly, her voice small. "I didn't think it would go this far. I just wanted to make people laugh. I thought it was funny at the time, but now I see it wasn't." Her words were simple, but they felt like they didn't do justice to how she was feeling. It wasn't just about being caught in the act. It was about realizing that her harmless moment of fun had turned into something she couldn't control. The man in the suit nodded slowly, as though considering her words. For a moment, the room was silent again, and Karen felt like she was waiting for a decision, a verdict, something that would tell her what would happen next. The officers exchanged a few glances, and Karen felt a growing sense of dread. She had no idea what would happen to her now, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't something that would just blow over with an apology. As Karen was escorted away, her mind spun with confusion. The initial shock of being singled out faded, But the reality of the situation set in. She had just splashed a royal guard with water, something she thought would be seen as nothing more than a harmless prank. Now, however, she was being led by two stern-faced guards away from the event, and the smiles from the crowd had long since disappeared. The light-hearted atmosphere had vanished, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. She tried to stay calm, but her thoughts were racing. She kept asking herself, "What did I do wrong? It was just water." But no matter how many times she replayed the situation in her head, she couldn't come up with a reason why it had escalated so quickly. The guards were walking beside her, their steps synchronized and purposeful, and Karen realized she wasn't going anywhere by herself. She had no choice but to follow them. The courtyard, which had once seemed so lively, was now a blur as she passed through it. She noticed the curious looks from the people who had gathered, some of them pointing in her direction. Karen couldn't decide if they were pitying her or if they found the situation amusing. Either way, it wasn't helping the anxiety building in her chest. The laughter she had heard moments before now felt distant, like it belonged to another time, another world. As they moved through the courtyard, Karen felt the eyes of more than just the people around her. It was as if everyone, from tourists to palace staff, was now watching her. The sound of her footsteps seemed to echo in her ears. The guards' calm, unflinching expressions made it clear that this wasn't some small misunderstanding. It was serious. One of the guards looked at her briefly, and Karen quickly dropped her gaze to the ground. She couldn't read his face, but the intensity of his stare made her feel like she was in trouble, even though she still didn't fully understand why. They soon reached a small side door to the palace, a place Karen hadn't noticed during the event. It looked plain, nothing special compared to the grand entrances she had seen earlier. The guard opened the door, gesturing for her to step inside. Karen hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding. Was this some kind of official process she was about to go through? Was she really in trouble for splashing someone with water? The idea seemed absurd, but the way the guards were treating her made it all too real. Once inside, the atmosphere changed again. It was cool, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of old wood and stone. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls as they walked down a narrow hallway. Karen could hear muffled voices ahead, but she couldn't make out what was being said. She felt like she was walking deeper into a place where she didn't belong, and the feeling of being out of place only grew stronger with each step. The guard stopped in front of a small plain room. One of them knocked on the door, and after a brief pause, it was opened by a man in a uniform who looked at Karen with an expression that was somewhere between curiosity and concern. "Bring her in," he said, stepping aside. Karen was now so overwhelmed with nervousness that she could hardly think straight. What were they going to do to her? Was she in real trouble? As she stepped inside, she realized the room wasn't as intimidating as it seemed from the hallway. It was an ordinary office, with papers stacked neatly on a desk, a few chairs, and a window that let in the dim light from outside. But what made it more uncomfortable was the presence of the people already in the room. The officer who had spoken to her, a couple of other staff members, and a man in a suit who she hadn't seen before. They all watched her as she entered, and Karen suddenly felt very small. The officer gestured for her to sit down, and she did, nervously glancing from one person to the next. The reality of the situation was beginning to settle in, and Karen felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just about a prank anymore. This was something much more serious, and she was about to find out exactly how serious it was. At first, Karen thought everything was just going to be a funny memory, something she could laugh about later. The crowd around her was still chuckling, some people even giving her thumbs up for the playful act. But as she stood there, a feeling started to creep over her. It wasn't anything she could explain right away, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The royal guard, who had stood so still at first, now seemed to be moving. They weren't laughing. They weren't even blinking. They were all staring at her. Karen felt the weight of their eyes on her, cold and intense. One of the guards who had been standing nearby took a few deliberate steps forward. His face remained expressionless, but his posture was sharper than before. There was something in the way he moved that made Karen's heart skip a beat. He wasn't just standing still anymore. He was walking toward her. The other guards were also slowly adjusting their positions, a quiet tension hanging in the air. Karen couldn't help but notice how serious they looked now, their faces unmoving and their hands steady by their sides. They were no longer statues. They were living, breathing figures of authority. She started to wonder if she might have made a mistake. Her lighthearted mood began to change as the reality of the situation hit her. It was just water. After all, nothing too harmful. She hadn't even splashed it that much. Yet the way the guards were now standing made her feel like she had done something much worse. She glanced nervously at the people around her, but their laughter had died down. The crowd, once full of amusement, now seemed to be watching with curious eyes. Some people looked uneasy, whispering to each other. It wasn't the same friendly vibe as before. One of the guards stepped even closer to her, and his voice broke through the silence. "Come with us," he said firmly. His words weren't loud, but they were filled with a quiet authority that made Karen feel small. He wasn't asking her to leave. He was telling her. Karen's heart raced. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. She tried to smile, hoping it would break the tension, but the guard's gaze didn't waver. The calm composure in his eyes made it clear that this wasn't some minor inconvenience. This was something more serious. Karen quickly glanced around, looking for an escape, but she knew there was nowhere to run. The guards were now surrounding her, moving with precision, as if they had practiced this moment countless times. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what had just happened. It was supposed to be a harmless joke, just a silly prank to make people laugh. But now, it seemed like she had stepped into something she didn't fully understand. What had seemed like fun only moments ago had turned into something completely different. She wasn't sure what to expect, but deep down, she felt the tension in the air. The seriousness of the situation had begun to sink in, and Karen realized that this wasn't going to end the way she had imagined. Before she could say anything, another guard appeared beside the one who had spoken to her. "This way," he instructed, his voice cold but calm. With that, Karen was guided away from the crowd, feeling like she was walking down a path she had never meant to take. The lighthearted atmosphere she had once been part of was now replaced with something far more intense, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to find out just how much her little prank had truly cost her. Karen was a young woman who loved having fun and making people laugh. She had always been the life of the party, always up for a little mischief if it meant bringing a smile to someone's face. One bright afternoon, she found herself at a grand event held in the heart of the city, right in front of an ancient palace. The day was perfect, sunny with a gentle breeze, the type of day that made you want to be outside, soaking in the beauty of the moment. People of all ages were gathered in the large courtyard, enjoying the event, snapping photos, and chatting excitedly. As Karen wandered through the crowd, she couldn't help but notice the royal guards standing tall and still like statues at the front gates of the palace. These guards were part of the city's history, well known for their impressive uniforms and stern expressions. They stood unmoving, holding their positions in perfect military discipline. To Karen, they seemed almost too serious for such a joyful occasion. She glanced around at the people who were snapping photos of the guards, admiring their outfits, and she thought, what if I gave them a little surprise? She wasn't one to shy away from a challenge, and besides, she had a mischievous idea that was just too good to ignore. Karen, being quick on her feet, noticed a small stand selling bottled water nearby. She bought one, the cold water feeling refreshing in her hand. As she stood there, an idea formed in her mind. She could give one of those royal guards a playful surprise. The thought of it made her giggle. With a quick look around to make sure no one was watching too closely, Karen walked toward the closest guard. The crowd was busy admiring the palace, so no one seemed to be paying her much attention. She stepped up to the guard, trying to keep a straight face, though she could already feel the excitement bubbling inside her. With a flick of her wrist, she splashed the water right on the guard's chest. For a brief moment, the guard didn't move at all. His eyes remained fixed ahead, and his stance never wavered. But then, a few people in the crowd noticed what had just happened, and the first wave of laughter spread through them. Karen stood back, trying to hold in her own laughter as she watched the surprised faces in the crowd. She was proud of herself. This was a harmless prank, after all, and everyone was laughing. The guard remained perfectly still, a professional in every sense of the word. Karen didn't think much of it. After all, it was just a little water. What could possibly go wrong? As she stood there, enjoying the attention and the laughter from the people around her, Karen didn't expect what would happen next. The other royal guards nearby had begun to shift slightly, their attention now focused on her. A subtle tension filled the air, and the smile that had been on Karen's face slowly began to fade as she noticed their serious stares. But she still didn't understand what she had done wrong. She was just having fun, right? It was all meant to be in good humor. She looked around at the crowd, still chuckling, but then something shifted. The mood in the air had changed, and Karen couldn't shake the feeling that her joke might not have been as harmless as she had thought.